This video is brought to you by me, I guess, kinda. As long-time viewers of the channel will know, around this time of year, I start sticking my hand out and asking for money like the junkies at your local transit hub. But unlike Uncle Ringo and them, you don't have to worry whether this next handout is going to be the one that finally sends me up yonder. For the last 6 years or so, me and a very small, literally 2 handfuls of volunteers have been distributing book bags and school supplies to the community where I grew up, or at least close enough to it, because honestly, there isn't really a space big enough near my old block to pull it off, but whatever. Point is, poor kids are getting what they need to do the knowledge and all that. And with y'all's help, last year was the biggest one we've done yet. So kudos to y'all, I guess. Nah, jokes aside, thank y'all. That said, my goal is to double what we did last year, so that's 500 bags. And you know, y'all hear folk like me talk all the time about praxis. Well, here's some for you if you can't find it or don't know what praxis means. And don't worry, neither did I until I started this stupid channel. Really, don't worry about it. Go to the GoFundMe link in the description and be a blessing to somebody today. Now, I'm not going to lie to y'all and say that what you give to me, you'll get back in the form of a new G-Wagon or a 4-bed colonial or something. Or I guess I could, and I could probably start a church at least half the size of Jake's by tomorrow.
Have you ever been swallowed up?
But I will say that you'll give the little homies and homettes around the way one less reason to give OG Mud Dog the time of day once school time comes around. So yeah, I'm basically a one-man crash unit is what I'm saying, with 10 times the efficacy. Again, go to the link in the description and give a couple dollars to help some kids in need today, man. All right, let's go ahead and get to what y'all really came here for. Okay, so here's some light work for y'all, because honestly, this topic ain't really too much to say about it, but also I just didn't feel like pulling out the tripod and setting up the camera and all that other garbage, man. Just, whatever, it's free content, man. Just be happy. So I'm sure that most of y'all are at least familiar with the name Caitlin Clark, or at least you were between March and May of this year, even if you're not a regular sports ball watcher. But for y'all that, for whatever reason, don't know, Caitlin was the hottest thing smoking in the basketball world for basically the duration of the 23-24 women's basketball season. See, while the men's tourney was struggling to find a star to market itself around, and the NBA was too busy dealing with the ongoing grand model to baby mother crisis, the women were proving a point that actual hoop heads have been trying to get through the streamers and stan accounts alike for ever now. And that's that the women do draw when you give them a chance to. And there's no better evidence of this than the women's March Madness final outdrawing the men's for the first time in their histories earlier. Like I said before, the people who call the women's game boring just don't like basketball, to keep it a buck. In the same way that hip-hop Twitter doesn't actually like hip-hop. NBA Twitter is just a cacophony of stans, trolls, and gambling addicts who are too busy posting counting stats and comparing the attractiveness of their faves' latest flings to actually care about, let alone learn the game. I swear these girls are made in a factory or something. Point proven. Point being, the fact that prior to this past WNBA draft, the consensus among most male casual hoop fans was the women don't get paid because they're just that boring, brother dude Jack, is not at all surprising when most of those same men unironically use, well, I've never heard a baddie say turn on some Mr. Morale, as if they've ever been in the space with those baddies for that question to be asked to begin with, but that's aside from the point. But then Caitlin happened, and racist Twitter started paying attention to basketball again for the first time since Ja got suspended. And that attention wound up carrying over to the WNBA draft, where Caitlin was selected #1 overall and instantly became the face of that league, and the gender pay gap as a result. Now, the fact that Brittany Griner, one of the league's top stars for the past decade, literally had to do a bid in Putin's basement before the pay gap even became mainstream news again, and then became a non-issue until a white girl got slided aside, it's good that we're talking about this again. And this time, racist Twitter is actually on the right side. or at least they will be until football season starts, and then they can go back to bitching about Lamar, I guess. The problem is, just like with most things NBA related, the majority of people haven't the slightest clue what they're talking about, as evidenced by the women don't draw brother dude Jack that I've talked about like 2 seconds ago. The league is just not profitable. Haven't you heard? The NBA is giving them money. The girls just aren't hot enough to pay attention to, which, one, don't be stupid, dude. 2, why is that even a point of discussion? My bad. I forgot who we talking about here. The point I think a lot of people are missing, however, is that the point isn't whether the women should be paid the same as the men. And frankly, I really haven't seen anybody even argue that, except the imaginary feminazis that the people who argue against that point have conjured in their own head. The argument isn't that more people should be watching the games either if the women are going to be compensated properly. It's not even that the league should do a better job marketing its stars and securing TV deals that don't give your championship series a 10 a.m. time slot on a Friday morning and then say jack all to promote it. It's that the league knowingly underpays its players for no other reason than it just simply doesn't care. And that's what we're going to spend the next like 20 or so minutes talking about, I guess. Okay, so let's get a few things out the way first. Yes, the WNBA does not turn a profit, and it hasn't for at least the last decade or so. It's also true that the NBA endows the women's league with $15 million each year to help with operating costs. But ask yourself this: why though? Is it because the NBA is just a benevolent benefactor doing its part to make the game more inclusive? Like, if you believe that, then you probably don't know the difference between pick and roll and pick and pop. But my point is, the NBA owns the WNBA, or at least 50%. The other 50 goes to the league's 12 owners. And with that 50% stake comes 50% of the operating cost, including player salaries, benefits, and all of that nonsense. And I want y'all to keep that in mind as we travel further down this rabbit hole. I'll also concede that to the casual hoop fan, the men's game is probably more appealing, but not because it's necessarily better. I covered this in the Allen Iverson video, but since the dead ball era of the 90s and early to mid aughts, the league's rules have changed in a way that showcases the skill and athleticism of its individual stars while also allowing for a ton more scoring. So much, in fact, that the public opinion pendulum has kind of begun to swing in the other direction, to the point that this past season was the first that I can remember where even casual fans are calling for a more defensively minded game. The women's game is a lot closer to what you would have seen in the 90s. It's a slower, more methodical, and honestly more physical game. One that doesn't really fit the preference of the average 3 drive or dunk watcher. Again, I will concede that the WNBA is not profitable, but as history has shown, that hasn't really stopped leagues from paying their players in the past. According to sports economist Robert Ford, in 1953, the average MLB team generated $2.1 million worth of revenue, while paying an average of about $420,000 in salary to their players. That would equate to a little less than 21% of league revenue going to player salaries. Also, according to Ford, in the 1968-69 season, the then Seattle Supersonics generated $992,000 of revenue. Now, while there's no average salary report for that season, we do know that in the 70-71 season, the Sonics paid an average of $45,000 to each of its 14 players, coming out to $630,000 in player salaries, meaning the Sonics paid 63.5% of their team revenue directly to player salaries. According to a 1983 article by David Dupree of the Washington Post, the NBA paid out 59% of league revenue to player salaries, despite the league not being anywhere near as profitable back then as it is today, or even Major League Baseball in the 50s. Yet we see consistently year after year, all the way until the 2011 CBA, that the players received the majority share of league revenue. So what's the basis then? In a word, Unions. In 1953, MLB contracts had a reserve clause baked in that said that at the end of the contract's life, a player's current team had the right to renew that contract for 1 year under its current terms. And y'all can kind of already see how this could have been and was abused, right? Well, if you don't, for the NFL watchers in the audience, imagine being franchise tagged over and over and over again for basically the duration of your career without the benefit of being one of the top 5 highest paid players at your position. So yeah, the teams were able to have their cake and eat it too, directly at the expense of their players, is what I'm saying. The NBA of the 60s, on top of not being nearly as popular, ergo profitable as baseball, had competition in the ABA, something that Major League Baseball did not. TLDR, boomer ball players didn't have to settle for whatever the league was willing to pony up, because there was another marginally less popular league that would pay more just to keep you away from the competition. For the wrestling heads in the audience, it's basically like the Attitude Era, where the big 2 and sometimes even 3 promotions were just swapping stars back and forth by offering them ungodly amounts of cash. Some might even say overpaying them to stay or leave their current promotion. Now, I mean, when you make a living taking unprotected chair shots to the head, it's kind of hard to argue that any amount of money is overpay, but whatever. Y'all get my point is what I'm saying. Because of the direct competition from the ABA, the NBA had an incentive to pay its players at least their worth, something that the WNBA doesn't have. Even by 1976, when the ABA folded and wound up merging with the NBA, the damage had kind of already been done. Because you see, the NBA, like the MLB 20 years earlier, had reserve clauses also built into player contracts. This is why all-timers like Oscar Robertson wound up wasting their peak years on garbage teams with front offices who did jack all to make those teams competitive beyond that one player. Which is also why Robertson filed a suit against the league in 1970, alleging that the reserve clause violated antitrust laws. This resulted in the league settling with Robertson in 1976, creating the Oscar Robertson rule. This decision gave players the option to entertain offers from other teams once their current contract had expired, with the stipulation that their current team be given the right to match that offer, thus creating the beginnings of free agency. That said, it wasn't until the 84-85 season that unrestricted free agency was created by the 83 CBA. But also in that CBA was the salary cap. The cap's main purpose was to ensure that smaller market and thus less profitable teams were able to compete in the bidding wars with their more well-endowed cousins without running themselves out of business. Because yeah, for as much as that the league is not profitable argument gets thrown around, neither was the NBA for much of its history. According to that same Washington Post article, in 1983, only 7 of the league's 23 teams turned a profit, with the league as a whole reporting a loss of anywhere between $15 and $20 million. That's between 47 and 62 million in today's money. But that was just the cost of competition back then. For example, my Sixers generated approximately 7.6 million in revenue, minus the 7% that went to the league back then. They were also the highest paying team according to average player salary at $400,000 per player. That's about 4.8 million just on player salary alone. That's 63% of team revenue going to the players in 1983. And you know what else happened in 83? And no, I'm not nearly old enough to remember this. I wasn't even alive yet. Jesus. In fact, in the 82-83 season, player salary and benefits cost $280,000 more on average than the average team generated through ticket sales, which back then was really the only way that teams generated revenue. But again, there was an understanding that this was just the cost of winning, literally. And winning, if nothing else, put butts in the seats. Point being, just as it is today, you gotta spend money to make money, even if it's money you don't really have. The problem was that most owners literally just could not afford to keep up with the elitist of the elite, and thus necessitating a cap on spending. But even then, the NBA's cap is not hard like the NFL's. There's a bunch of exceptions and incentives like bird rights, luxury taxes, supermaxes, etc., that make it easier for poverty franchises to hold on to homegrown talent. Even with a cap, the idea that player salaries increase with profitability is not exactly true either. While players may be making more in terms of raw dollar amounts, the percentage of player revenue decreased from 57% in the 2005 CBA to between 49 and 51% based on league growth marks being met in the most recent CBA of 2011. Now, the argument can be made that the lockdown prior to the 2011-2012 season necessitated a pay cut just to get the players back on the floor and game checks back in their accounts. But since then, the league is experiencing literally its most profitable period in history, something to the tune of like $10 billion worth of revenue every year. And yet the players' share of it has been the same for over a decade now. Point being, despite the fact that average Tom, Dick, and Harrys like you and I may rightfully envy the salaries of the average NBA player, relative to the share that they enjoyed back in the day, and most definitely relative to the total value of their labor, NBA players are still getting shafted by the league. So what does any of this have to do with the ladies? Well, remember how I said to keep in mind that the NBA is literally the majority stakeholder of the WNBA? Remember that $15 million endowment? Yeah, if you haven't put the pieces of the puzzle together, the NBA could literally just increase the veterans minimum of the WNBA to $1 million today if they wanted to. But they don't, because there's no real incentive to. I mean, think about it. What competition do they have aside from the overseas leagues? And I mean, who really wants to go that far away from home just to be paid what you're worth when you can still carve out a relatively comfortable existence, even if you are getting bamboozled and shanghaied in the process? Now, I know what some of y'all are going to say. Why should the men have to do the women's job for them? They don't deserve free money. Well, you didn't deserve that nice fat tax refund you got a few years ago either, but that didn't stop you from blowing it all on Jordans and IG models until those Trump tax cuts came back to bite you in the ass then this year, now did ya? Well, I deserve that money because I pay my tax. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second, bucko, but let's move on for right now. And even then, the profit wasn't that big an issue in the 60s and the 70s when the league wasn't making any. It was the competition, like I said before. And even in the 80s and 90s when the league started to get its legs underneath it still wasn't. Remember, the issue wasn't that players were getting paid too much. It was that only a handful of teams could afford to pay those players that much. The percentages were just a way to make sure that the cap wasn't some super high number that would defeat its own purpose. All right, so back onto the well, do they deserve it thing. Well, remember again, the WNBA is owned by the Boys League. So my point is, it's an investment. And do you really think that the league is just pumping all the revenue back in the salary and benefits? And here's where the collective bargaining piece comes in. The WNBA CBA is not a clear 50-50 split as a lot of outlets intimated when it was first agreed upon. In addition to the guaranteed salaries that WNBA players get, according to the current CBA, what the league has done is institute incremental revenue sharing, meaning only the revenue shared beyond certain growth targets is shared with the players. The targets are not necessarily from year to year, but are cumulative from the time the CBA went into effect in 2020. So the growth target for 2024 is not 2024 alone, but the period between 2020 and 2024. So if the target for that period is 10 million, then whatever revenue is generated after that 10 million is then shared with the players. So does your head hurt yet? Don't worry, it's about to in a second, I promise you. So here's the formula to determine growth targets for each year. Starting from the year preceding the current CBA, the previous year's revenue plus 20% of that year's revenue. So we have to go all the way back to the 2019 season to figure out these target numbers. So let's say hypothetically that the league's revenue for the 2019 season was $100 million. Let's just pick a nice round number to make our heads hurt a little less. Then the target growth mark would be 20% of 100 million on top of that 100 million. So 120 million for the 2020 season, and then 142 million in the 21 season, 170 million in the 2022 season, and so on and so forth. So in this hypothetical scenario, that means 4 years out from the 2020 CBA, the WNBA would need to generate approximately 245 million in revenue before the profit sharing kicks in. And remember, it's only the revenue generated after that $240 million mark that actually gets shared. Even then, only 25% of the player's share actually goes directly to player salaries. The other 25% goes toward a media and marketing pool agreed upon by the union to help get to and past those growth targets I mentioned earlier. And again, that's if the league meets its cumulative growth targets, which it hasn't. Which is why, according to estimates by economist David Berry, the WNBA dedicates only 10% of league revenue to salaries as compared to the NBA's 40%. So just for the sake of putting the picture together, if the player's share of league revenue was truly 50%, as the league's PR department would lead you to believe, each player would receive a $3 million annual salary, according to Barry again. Again, keep in mind that the NBA owns half of the WNBA. So even if it did generate a profit, half of that goes to the men's league anyway. And that includes tickets, merch, TV deals, and everything that brings money into the league. If it sounds like somebody like Josh Giddey, a child predator, and Miles Bridges, who beats on women for fun, technically benefit more from Caitlin Clark jersey sales than Caitlin Clark does, that's because technically they kind of do. At EOD, even if you put the lack of exposure, the abysmal marketing, and the paltry broadcasting deals to the side, the only real reason the women get paid like paupers compared to the men is because of the primary stakeholder. The NBA just doesn't care enough to do something, man. And if this were the NFL or maybe even the MLB, I wouldn't feel so strongly about it, honestly. I mean, both those leagues know they ain't and take pride in not being but remember, this is the Black Lives Matters League, after all. The catchphrase for your surname league. The league that screams at the top of its lungs, gaze and be amazed and applaud me for how socially conscious I am, while effectively financing state-sponsored domestic terror and genocide, and also gives lifetime bans for literally betting on yourself, but not for beating your girlfriend. The NBA is the face of corporate capitalism, is what I'm saying. Progressive for the sake of profit and nothing more. And that, I think, makes me respect that league even less than the ones that don't try to hide how ass backwards they are. So why should you care is probably what you're saying. Honestly, I don't know, except for the fact that at EOD, we're all fighting the same fight, honestly. Like I've said in the past, a wage is still a wage, no matter how large it gets. And wherever there's a wage, there's a war against exploitation. So if you're really about that life, even if you do feel like ball players get paid a little too much to play a kid's game, then you can't allow your envy of that wage to dictate your allyship or something like that. Whatever, nigga. Next video is out in May.